Tonight, we're going to be talking about. Oh, hold on. Sorry, 1 second. There we go. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Handel's Giulio Cesare in Egitto, which is just simply Julius Caesar in Egypt. It is considered his greatest Italian opera from the early 18th century. And it's been honestly a real joy to put this presentation together for you all, and to be able to sort of, I guess, revisit all the incredible gems of this particular opera. As was pointed out to me earlier today, when I said that I was doing Julius Caesar for a Femme fatale, it was very, very astutely pointed out to me that Julius Caesar is not a femme fatale. However, the Julius Caesar's counterpart, Cleopatra, in the case of this opera, indeed is. And she'll be the focus of our conversation later on tonight when we get to sort of a more in-depth analysis. But for the time being, we're going to be talking about Baroque opera, which is until recently was kind of not so much in vogue. Maybe there was a bit of a revival in the 1960s, where there was a resurgence of interest in Handel's opera, in the operas of Monteverdi. And today, certainly this opera in particular is one of the single most performed Baroque operas in the repertoire. So let's see if we can actually. This thing never wants to cooperate. So, opera is generally considered to be one of the defining characteristics of the Baroque era. It is really the one unifying thing that encompasses the incredibly broad swath of music that inhabits the 1600s to 1750. Those are the general demarcations for the Baroque era, 1600 to 1750. 1750 being the death of J.S. Bach. And generally speaking, it's hard to really compare, for instance, the music of Monteverdi, who was writing in the late 1500s, early 1600s, to the music of Bach. But the things that they absolutely have in common, and what the Baroque has in common in general, is an interest in the highly ornate, in an incredibly stylized and sort of ornamented, complex music that is, in terms of its musical characteristics, first, it is the beginning of what we call common practice tonality, which is what music from about 1600 through 1900 uses. And then it continues to be used in especially pop music and all sorts of other non-classical genres today. It's definitely within the Western Hemisphere the most popular form of tonality of musical language. And this was established here in the Baroque. On top of that, there's a huge interest in sort of what's known as contrapuntal development. So these very complicated inner workings of one voice against another, of the way that you can take a subject and transpose it upon itself in multiple layers, and the way that those lines may work in tandem or against one another. And the opera, the first opera, Daphne by Jacopo Peri in 1579, was the result of this group called the Florentine Camerata, which was interested in the recreation of Greek tragedy. So, works by Sophocles, so on and so forth, that to their knowledge, and that this sort of re-interest in the classics that was a carryover from the Renaissance and whatnot, was very much the desire to imitate from historical accounts, how the Greeks would have originally staged these dramas. And they knew that it involved singing. They knew that it involved all sorts of musical accompaniment. They knew bits and pieces, but they wanted to actually see what it was really like, and that is the result. What is opera, and that is the reason for this genre of drama and music. It is in a perfect world, opera, or in the perfect work, opera is the complete synthesis of these two elements. And the thing that characterizes opera through its development from 1600, or I guess technically 1579, to the modern day, it constitutes as drama, has changed immensely over the centuries. And now in steps Claudio Monteverdi, whose opera L'Orfeo, based on the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, is considered the first operatic masterpiece of all time. And it is a great example, again, of what we consider when it comes to this original intent of opera. It's classical mythology dramatized. And most importantly, Monteverdi was known for his vocal music outside of opera, secular and, for instance, madrigals, and sacred. So he would write vespers for the church. And his biggest contribution to the genre was the invention of the aria. And many of you, of course, probably know what an aria is. But in the framework of the Baroque, it is a number of things. First, it is usually much more extensive than what you would see in a classical opera, say by Mozart or Haydn. It is about twice the length, and it is kind of a bit of a portrait, or you could say an X-ray into the soul of the character at the given point in time. To give you an example of this, we're going to just listen to a short excerpt, Possente Spirito from L'Orfeo, which is the scene in which Orpheus descends into the underworld and has to convince the ferryman to the underworld, Charon, that he must be reunited with Eurydice. So a couple of things to note here. First, the incredibly elaborate ornamentation of the vocal part. Monteverdi, in this particular aria, actually wrote two versions of the aria in the score. One, just the basic melody, and the second, this incredibly elaborate ornamentation. And we'll see that that's going to be very important to to opera in the future, especially in the Baroque. The second thing, of course, is that in arias, as opposed to recitatives, which we'll get to, arias are use very few words. I actually didn't bother trying to find something with the translation because he's saying so few things, that it's all about the expression of the emotion, almost rendering the word superfluous. The words are essentially in this context of the aria are subservient to the music. The text is subservient to the music. And of course, another interesting little facet here is the obbligato instrument, as we call it, the solo violin that we heard that was giving a sort of a call and response to Orpheus's aria, to the lyrics, to the melody. And we're going to talk more about Monteverdi in several months from now when we talk about his other very notable opera, the Coronation of Poppea, L'Incorazione di Poppea. But for now, we're going to talk about some of the offshoots of what happened, because Handel fits squarely into the Italian opera tradition of Monteverdi. But there are other options. There are the French and the English options. The first of which is the Tragédie en musique, which is the French opera ballet. Now, what's important to remember is that in France, ballet, what we think of today, Swan Lake, Tchaikovsky, so on and so forth, came from the early, 1500s, 1600s court dances from France that were sort of such a cultural icon of the French culture that it actually transported its way into opera. And as a matter of fact, from about the 1600s all the way through the end of the 1800s to the turn of the century, opera and ballet were viewed as one thing. All operas staged in France had to have a ballet. Now, in the 1800s, that meant perhaps a 15-minute interlude, a divertissement, in the middle of the opera. But in these 5-act tragédie en musique operas, they would occur at the end of every act. And similar to the Italian opera, which inspired, of course, these French opera ballets, there had to be an element of classical mythology, or perhaps a poetic epic that inspired the story. And one of the most famous composers of this genre was Jean-Baptiste Lully, who was the composer of Armide, an opera from 1686. As you can see here, by the way, on the left, I've given us a picture of the Church of St. Ignatius of Loyola. I just wanted to briefly take a quick tangent here. This is the architectural equivalence of the Baroque. As you can see, it's over the top, to say the least. But this I guess is the visual analog for the kind of music that we're going to be discussing today. So one of the most notable parts of Lully, which was potential, it's hard to say whether or not Handel was familiar with either of these two examples I'm going to be given. It's very likely he was familiar with the Monteverdi, but it's hard to say if he was familiar with these two. However, I said that I would address this. So the recitative is the part that happens in between the arias. You could view it the other way around, though, I suppose. And if the aria is a contemplation on sort of the inner workings of the characters' minds, the inner workings of their souls, the recitatives is all the outside action that's happening. It's the thing that moves the plot forward. And it's essentially sung speech. What the main sort of orchestral difference for the singers is that recitative is always with just basso continuo instruments, which are things like the harpsichord, cellos. Sometimes you'll have some orchestral accompaniment, full orchestral accompaniment, but usually it is a sort of dry orchestration, as where the full orchestra, the full complement of instruments, will be part of the arias. And this is true all the way through the classical era. And then it starts to sort of become a little wonky around Rossini, Donizetti, the turn of the 19th century. So this is Amphi, Il est ma puissance, from Act 2, Scene 5 of Armide. This is where she has captured, the enchantress Armide has captured her rival and tries to stab him unsuccessfully, and she's realizing that she's fallen in love with him. But you'll notice it's an incredibly dramatic rendering of this text, despite the fact that it's really only a handful of instruments. If it's not Italian, of course, is the English Masque, which is a type of quarterly entertainment that dated back from the Renaissance. And what it resulted in was a type of genre called semi-opera, which was particularly pioneered by Henry Purcell, whose Dido and Aeneas is considered one of the finest English language operas prior to the 20th century, which is quite a long stretch to go without a good opera. But these operas are actually generally quite short. Unusually, this is about an hour-long opera. And in particular, this aria that I'll be playing a short excerpt from you, When I Am Laid in Earth, Dido's lament for Aeneas's departure and subsequent suicide, or rather Dido's subsequent suicide, is it's one of the great arias of all time. And one thing that in particular that is notable is what is called the ground bass lament, which is to say there is a repeating downward moving figure in the bass line of the orchestra, in the basso continuo instruments, in the lower instruments. And this is touching on something we're going to address in Handel, which is the rhetoric of Baroque music. Classical rhetorics are of extreme importance to composers of the Baroque, and these sort of signifiers, these almost like in a painting where, if you see somebody with a lute, you know that there is the suggestion of love, or if you see somebody reading a secret letter, you know there's an affair going on. Similarly, in music, there are sort of tells for what is happening in the music, even if the words do or don't reflect it. Sometimes they are in opposition, sometimes they are working together. And this sort of clash or juxtaposition or working together of these two elements, the text and the music, become an incredibly important part, especially when we're looking at these very distinct portraits that arias portray of the characters. So again, although Handel may not have known these works, he may not have heard them, he may have been familiar with the score, these devices, these dramatic devices from the Italian, the French, and the English were more than at his disposal. And this kind of, this confluence of ideas led to him being one of the most important Italian opera composers. But let's talk a little bit about Handel, because he, of course, as I've said, he's I've said this before, which is always quite funny if you really think about it. But he's a German-born English composer writing Italian operas, and it's a funny way that he got here, but that's how it happened. But he was born in Halle, which is where Saxony was at the time, and his father was adamant that he not become a musician, that he study the law. But he found that he had quite a proclivity towards it. And he studied to be a violinist and an organist. He worked in Hanover and Hamburg and Italy as a composer, as an organist. And in Italy is where he started writing his first operas. And he moved to London in 1711. Now, as I mentioned, he is generally considered to be an English composer, even in spite of the fact that he himself is German-born, and was very much resented by the local musical establishment for taking so much of their work. There were a lot of foreign-born composers at that time who were much preferred over the local talent, for the reason that, well, for one reason or another, that they were better composers, and also that they were writing Italian opera. Because by the 1920s, there was an absolute craze for Italian opera. And for reasons that we'll touch on in a second, but so much so that the Queen Anne actually founded the Royal Academy of Music in 1719 and put Handel in charge of the orchestra as the master of orchestra. And during his time in England, from 1711 to his death, he wrote 42 of these opera seria. And when when there was a sort of decline in interest in opera seria, he turned to writing oratorios. An oratorio, an example, would have been The Messiah. These unstaged dramatic works for chorus and soloists that would have been of either liturgical or secular nature. But in this space of time between 1720 to 1733, he wrote 18 operas alone. And in 1724, Giulio Cesare was one of those operas. And Handel is generally considered, for this reason, for the quality of his work, to be the one of the most important dramatists between Monteverdi and Mozart, and was hugely influential on both Mozart and Haydn in the way that they wrote their operas. So opera seria, which is sort of an offshoot, the resultant offshoot of Monteverdi's and the Florentine Camerata creations, is an extremely stylized form of opera. As I've mentioned, the aria and the recitative are the predominant forms of musical, musical form that were used. And this is distinct from later works, say by Mozart, which would have included duets or trios or sextets, choral numbers. For instance, in Giulio Cesare, I believe there are only 2 duets, and I can say that there's a choral number at the very beginning to open the opera and a choral number to end the opera. It was all about the aria. And not only that, but these arias were in a extremely stylized and rigid form called the da capo aria. Da capo simply meaning from the head, which is to say that there would be a first section, a contrasting section, followed by a return to the beginning, or a return to the head of the aria, almost to recontextualize those words. We'll be talking about Piangeros la sorte mia from the Act 3, Cleopatra's aria, where at first she describes her grief at being sentenced to die, at the loss of Julius Caesar, the loss of her brother Ptolemy, and then it switches abruptly to this vengeful aria, this vengeful B section, where she talks about how she's going to haunt all those who've betrayed her as a ghost. And then she returns to the beginning of the aria and sings again about her fate. And it's interesting. The trick of it, as the performer, is to recontextualize what you have just sung about, in terms of the emotion. The feeling that Cleopatra has of having thought about gaining vengeance after, rather having. Let me rephrase that. The loss that she is experiencing now, having thought of the vengeance that she wishes to seek. And the second part of that recontextualization is the ornamentation of the aria. So when you return to the beginning, it is expected that the singer will change and ornament and embellish the aria as it was existing. And these arias, in a sense, sort of depict a series of changing fortunes. Another part of a Handel opera in particular, but a lot of these Baroque operas, is the French overture format, which was extremely popular. It is a very stately type of two-part music. So there's first the dotted rhythms, the dum, da dum, da dum, da da, that occurs in a slow meter, in this sort of stately entree, a king's entrance, followed by what we call a contrapuntal fast section, a fugal fast section, where usually it is a three-part fugue where a subject is given to three different lines, each in succession, that overlap and work together in interesting musical ways. And this sounds more or less like this from the overture to Julius Caesar. So you can see this is, again, it's very stylized. It's very sort of rigid, but it was an extremely popular form of overture, and these were certainly produced not only by Handel but by Bach, even by certainly by all of the French composers we've mentioned. But this was the general format for these operas. And you can see quickly why this might fall out of fashion. However, this form was extremely popular, especially in 1720s London. The other big draw for these operas were the castrato singers. Now, castrato or castrati singers were men who had been castrated before puberty, so that they would maintain their voice wouldn't break, and give them the ability to sing in the same range as women. And the reason for this is that in the 17th century, in the church, there was a papal ban on women singing in churches. And for this reason, they were able to keep on the choir boys, the young choir boys, who they had as the sopranos, as the mezzos, the altos that they needed for their choral works. And what wound up happening is that as time went on, it became more interesting to composers outside of the church to write for these singers in operas as starring roles. And these singers were apparently incredible. They apparently they had an incredible ability for flexibility, endurance, and it's actually one of the big reasons that these operas went out of fashion was because eventually the papal ban was lifted and was not deemed necessarily a humane practice. And the final operas that we saw containing these roles were by Rossini and Meyerbeer in the early 1800s. But these singers back then were a huge draw. They were essentially pop stars of their time. And these arias were essentially showcases, and it was sort of, it's an interesting balance between finding a showcase and being able to really write something artistic. I mean, in this opera alone, Giulio Cesare, there are 4 castrato singers, Julius Caesar and Ptolemy being 2 of them. And what we do today to account for this is that there's a couple of different options. You can fill the role with a countertenor, which is the most preferred role, a male singing in his falsetto. You can also fill them with a pants role, with women singing the parts. You can also transpose it to a tenor, but usually the former 2 are preferred. And in today's production, we'll see that all of the roles are filled by countertenors. Now, in an opera seria, we see that the subject tends to be, or rather is always, classical mythology, history, or something biblical. And the general message of any opera seria is that love and duty will underscore the moral message of virtue. And an interesting counterpoint to that is that the protagonist can't engage in immoral behavior, which is an interesting sort of twist in this particular opera because of Cleopatra's role and her characteristic as a femme fatale, so to speak. But all endings for all these operas have to be happy endings. For instance, in Orpheus and Eurydice, where, of course, in the classical story, Orpheus looks back and loses Eurydice. But in the case of other adaptations during this period, there would be what would be called a deus ex machina, a sort of saving through divine grace. Apollo would bring Eurydice back from the dead in spite of the fact that he looked behind him. And one of the most important writers, the librettists for these operas, was Pietro Metastasio, whose poetic and flowery dramas were full of these intricate, grandiose plots, these sort of something that would keep interest, even if it was sort of the same thing over and over again. His subjects tended to be more towards classical mythology, the triumph of virtue, same stuff. Haydn, Mozart, Gluck, Handel all wrote operas based on Metastasio plots. And as I mentioned, these operas, the opera seria, lost popularity in the mid 18th century, mostly because of its repetitive nature. Because people were looking for something different, so they were looking for something dramatically different, and also because of the sheer expense of these castrato singers, and for the actual stage designs, the stage settings, all of that was getting awfully expensive, and it just fell out of favor. So this particular opera, here we have Senesino, who was the original Giulio Cesare. This particular setting of Giulio Cesare is about the Roman Civil War in 49 to 45 BC. It is about specifically Ptolemy's, or rather, no. It's about, oh shoot. See, I'm having a mental blank. I have my note. This is what happens when you're preparing. Sometimes you just forget who you're talking about. Pompey, who has just attempted to overthrow Julius Caesar, is fleeing Rome, and he is taken in by Ptolemy of Egypt, who then in turn beheads him and gives him over to Julius Caesar, who in a rage is furious about Ptolemy's behavior, views him as a barbarian, and this is discovered then in turn by Cornelia and Sextus, the wife and the son of Pompey, who together with Julius conspire to overthrow Ptolemy. Cleopatra, Ptolemy's wife and sister, is of course also trying to gain power from Ptolemy, and she intends to seduce Julius Caesar, which she does, and the two fall in love. And in a series of sort of ups and downs of battle, finally Julius Caesar and Cleopatra are victorious. Ptolemy is deposed, and the story ends there. It doesn't go on to talk about the eventual murder of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra's return to Egypt. But more importantly, this was a popular and well-known subject, and there, of course, are an incredible number of liberties taken with the history, but it would have been easy to follow, something that would have been familiar. The libretto was actually adapted from a previous adaptation of Julius Caesar by Nicola Haim, who worked closely with Handel in the creation of this opera. The main roles are as follows. There are 4 Romans and 4 Egyptians: Julius Caesar, Cornelius Sesto, and Curio, the captain of the guard. And for the Egyptians, Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Nireno being a vizier, and Aquila, the head of the guards for Ptolemy. And the orchestration is very characteristic of a Baroque opera. There's more of sort of a lusciousness to the quality of Handel's orchestration, in that he includes sort of things that would have been much more exotic and much more exciting for a Baroque English audience that maybe seems perhaps familiar to us today, but would have been very unusual for the time. He includes transverse flute and recorders. There was no distinction in terms of what a flute was. A flute back then could have been either a recorder or a flute. That's why we refer to these, a modern day flute, as a transverse flute, it being perpendicular to the body, as opposed to the flauto dolce, which was the recorder. So these two instruments are distinct, although they both go by flute in the Baroque era. Two oboes, two bassoons, four horns, and strings. And of course, there are obligato instruments, solo instruments, just like in the Monteverdi, which we'll explore a little bit of in this opera. And of course, there are the basso continuo instruments, the underlying harmonic fundamental for the entire opera and really for all Baroque music. This is a defining feature of Baroque music, is this harmonic underpinning that actually has to be realized. It has to be fleshed out by the harpsichord, by the theorbo. The theorbo being the arc lute, an extremely large lute, low strings, bassoons, so on and so forth. And this is essentially the structure for which Handel is working with. Now, as I mentioned, the most important part of Baroque opera is classical rhetoric. And there are three things I'm going to touch on that I think, especially in this opera, are the biggest demarcations for this. The first is the doctrine of the affectations, which is a guiding artistic principle for the Baroque era. It is based on classical philosophy, classical rhetoric, and it is, in the case of the visual arts and the musical arts especially, the sort of imperative that a piece of music must capture in its essence a spirit or affect so completely that an audience is sort of enraptured by it. So when I say a spirit or an affect, I'm talking about jealousy or love or happiness or sorrow. The Da Capo aria is sensibly incredibly well suited for this idea of the doctrine of affectations. In Piangero la sorte mia from Act 3, which I've just talked about a little bit ago, we'll see that Handel uses that ground bass lament from that we heard back in Purcell's Dido and Aeneas to sort of represent the grief and the sorrow of Cleopatra, which is then in turn, when it switches to the B section of the Da Capo aria, a flurry of fast notes depicting her rage and her desire for vengeance. So here we have Nathalie Dessay performing one of the most famous arias from Giulio Cesare, Piangero la sorte mia. and then, of course, back to the beginning. So you can hear very clearly the very marked distinctions between the different characters. And, you know, they actually went so far as to assign each key a very particular emotion associated with it in certain theoretical texts. Certain dances, as we'll discuss now, were also associated with very particular emotions, very particular types of affect. And the jig, or as it would be in Irish, which was then transported over to Italy to be the giga, was a popular type of more rustic dance, noted for its dotted rhythm, dum 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 dum. And in this finale, for instance, the rhetoric here is, of course, that there is joy, that there is happiness for the defeated Ptolemy, and for the love of Cleopatra and of Julius Caesar. So here's the finale, or rather the penultimate number of the opera, which is a duet between the two. So the last part of this is something that is called topic theory, which is that there are musical indicators similar to, say, the ground bass that evoke or suggest a deeper meaning in the music. So, for instance, Va tacito e nascosto from Act 1 is an aria in which Julius Caesar realizes that Ptolemy is seeking to depose of him and to kind of get him out of the way. But they're meeting one another and they're trying to exchange formal niceties. But meanwhile, he is singing in this aria about how when hunting, you have to be quiet, you have to be careful. And the way that he sort of enriches this meaning is by having a French horn obbligato instrument play as a solo instrument in the aria. And the reason that this sort of adds deeper meaning, of course, is that horns are associated with hunting, the hunting horn of Julius Caesar, as it were. So a more elaborate example of this is in Vadoro Pupile, which is certainly as soon as I can find this, is Cleopatra's seduction aria from Act 2. Now, this work is more of an exotic setting. It actually, in the score, is instructed this very particular setting where Cleopatra is singing to Julius Caesar with an orchestra on stage. Again, this would have been sort of a wow factor for the 18th century audience. But it's described as a garden of cedars with a prospect of Mount Parnassus, which is the home of the Muses, on which is seated the Palace of Virtue, which is kind of ironic, of course, given the fact that she's trying to seduce Caesar. And what we have is a very lavish orchestration of bassoons, harp, unusually, oboes, viola da gamba, all this sort of extra stuff on stage. So sort of really up the ante. So this is the way that Handel is able to give characters life. These are the tools at his disposal, this type of rhetoric. It's interesting, you have a character like Aquila, who is boorish and is constantly trying to woo Cornelia, and his arias of these sort of declarations of love are incredibly bombastic. Ptolomeo is sort of silky and slimy and spiteful. Sesto is full of vengeance for his father. Cornelia is full of woe and sorrow, and Caesar is full of course, this sort of warlike, almost noble defiance. But the real character of interest, the true heroine of the story, is in fact Cleopatra, who's the only character who actually sort of changes her tone throughout the opera. And not only that, but she's also the biggest plot driver for the opera. It is her seduction of Julius Caesar that sort of precipitates the events that unfold. And as I'll sort of demonstrate here, there are three types of emotion that she shows. There's, of course, this manipulative, selfish type of love that she tries to exercise over Julius Caesar with this Vadoro Pupile. And this sort of, again, these lush, intense, melodic music that is intended to seduce. These rhetorical devices that indicate that. On the other side of that, at the beginning of Act 1, we have a youthful, mischievous, sort of innocent girl making fun of her brother. Let's see. And you'll see that there's sort of a lightness. This is through the key that he picks, the tonality that he picks, the rhythms that he chooses, the type of vocal writing that he gives to Cleopatra, rather than this sort of scintillating softness. It's much more spiky almost. And then, of course, finally, at the end of Act 2, when she is defeated by Ptolemy, and it seems that all is lost, we have this incredible catharsis of the realization that she truly does love Julius Caesar, and that she doesn't know what she's going to do. And it is almost, again, through this rhetoric, this musical rhetoric, this transformation, that the catharsis comes, and that her ability to be virtuous, to be noble, to be sort of true, is ultimately the real reason for her success, for her ultimate triumph over Ptolemy. So we see that Cleopatra is not necessarily what we would consider by our standards, perhaps, a femme fatale, but in the terms of the context that her character is created and sort of understood. Of course, as we've discussed, these characters are not sort of allowed to have flaws, to have vices. This is sort of one of the earlier archetypes for this type of character. And it's interesting, in particular, the way that she does develop, that she's the only one to really develop throughout this opera. And really, this type of dramatic form, the more that you sort of listen to it, the more that you understand the various ways that the composer is trying to communicate through form, through harmony, through motive, through dance, texture, if that's what it is. These sort of essential parts of what we hear when we listen to Baroque music, to Baroque opera in particular, the richer the experience is. And I absolutely encourage you to listen to the whole opera. It is really kind of gem after gem after gem. It's a gorgeous work, and it's a sort of a wonderful insight into human emotion, just almost on a very pure level that is not achieved too many places in such a sort of concentrated way as it is in this kind of opera. So if there are any questions, now's the time. I'm happy to take any that you might have. But if there are none, we'll look forward to seeing you next time, which will be for Parsifal, which will be in June. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you again, NCMC, for hosting these talks. It's lovely to be able to do this. Thank you.